In the third part of the seminar, I will go very briefly through the economic interpretation of normative relationships. Commons is an American economist active a few years after Oefeld. He studied in depth the sale transaction as the smallest unit of economic activity. As we saw last week, a sale is a bilateral contract between a buyer and a seller. However, in a market, there is always at least one alternative buyer and one alternative seller. If not, it will not be a market. If the market is regulated, there is also an enforcer to which parties refer to if things do not work as expected. By looking at this core setting, Commons observed that there are additional bindings between the ones that are made explicit by the sale contract. For instance, alternative buyer and sellers should not intervene with a deal that has been accepted. Suppose that you bought a car for a certain amount. While you were going to take it, another person would have bought it with a much higher price. The seller could provide you back your money, perhaps even with some damages. But if everybody would do so, the market would become much less predictable. So how Oefeld compares with Commons? Oefeld was concerned with two parties before a court. The court observes and interprets the facts. The parties have some conflicts of interests, which is made clear by the normative relationships. Commons is concerned instead with the unit of economic activity, a sale transactions with all their participants. There is a larger variety of social structure involved, and market and competition are also part of the picture. Note that neither Oefeld or Commons were talking about rules or norms. Commons made clear that dual positions have an economic value. This economic value is due to their scarcity. If someone takes a dual position, someone else may be excluded. This is the case for property, but also for marriage, citizenship, domicile, registration of a certain vehicle, and so on. The correct functioning of the market requires positive and negative reinforcement mechanisms, which are controlled by an enforcer. In order to operate, however, the enforcer needs to be assigned with adequate powers and duties. Let us consider the sale example again. When someone enters in a transaction, this excludes the competitor. The buyer excludes competitor buyers who would have paid a higher price. The seller excludes competitor sellers who would have accepted a lower price. Note that in principle they could decide intentionally a much lower price of the market, for instance to avoid to pay taxes over a desired transaction. This is an actual fraud which is still used today. This is an internal agreement and tells that the two parties are not acting independently at arm's length, then disrupting the functioning of the market. And that's why we need an enforcer to intervene in those cases. Using Commons' scheme, we can describe three types of general institutional failures, all caused by collapses between parties that should in principle be independent. In a monopoly or cartel, parties on the same vertical axis form a unity, and they become then able to set their price on the market, so disrupting competition. In a swap scheme, two dual parties takes an agreement outside the domain in which the transaction takes place. For instance, in match-fixing frauds, one or more soccer players play in a way to obtain a result decided in advance. They look like as they play normally, the transaction here would be the game, but that's not the case. In a short-circuit scheme, the party on the one side takes also the dual role, short-circuiting the competition. For instance, with the advent of peer-to-peer sharing, content consumers become also content publishers. This technology made very accessible and easy to do something which was before not possible or very expensive. It remains to be understood whether you can recover an institution once it has been short-circuited. Services like Netflix and Spotify, for instance, allowing easier access to content with relatively low price, have reduced piracy, but still the situation for the content creators has not generally improved. And with this we end our second week's seminar. Thank you very much for your attention.